The invitation arrived in a thick, cream-colored envelope, the type that usually holds wedding invitations or announcements of some grand event. Inside, however, was a simple handwritten note, elegant in its brevity: "Dear Mr. Dalton, your reputation precedes you. I require your services urgently. Enclosed is a generous retainer. Please come to my estate at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, George Ellsworth." The card had no contact number, no additional details, just a signature that oozed old money and status. And it came with a check large enough to make even the most seasoned detective's eyebrows rise. I had heard of George Ellsworth before. A reclusive millionaire, Ellsworth inherited his vast wealth from a long line of wealthy industrialists. His estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town, was said to be both a marvel of architecture and a relic of a bygone era. Yet, the whispers that circulated among those who had dealings with him were what intrigued me the most. Stories of strange occurrences, staff who never stayed long, and most disturbingly, a string of mysterious deaths. Naturally, I was curious. When I arrived at Ellsworth Manor, the iron gates creaked open as if on cue. The driveway wound through an ancient forest, the trees towering over me, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, as if trying to claw their way out of the earth. The mansion loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the gray sky. Its many windows glinted like the eyes of a predator, watching my every move. The door was opened by a man who could only be described as the archetypal butler, tall, gaunt, and with a face as expressionless as a marble statue. "Mr. Ellsworth is expecting you," he said in a voice that echoed through the cavernous entrance hall. As I stepped inside, the air grew noticeably colder. The interior of the mansion was grand yet oppressively dark, with heavy drapes blocking out most of the daylight. The walls were adorned with portraits of Ellsworth's ancestors, their eyes following me with unsettling intensity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Ellsworth himself was waiting for me in a drawing room at the back of the house. He was older than I expected, with a stooped posture and a face lined with years of what must have been immense stress. His pale blue eyes were sharp, though, and he wasted no time with pleasantries. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Dalton," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'll get straight to the point. My house, it's cursed." I raised an eyebrow. "Cursed," Ellsworth nodded. "There's no other way to describe it. In the last 5 years, 7 people have died under my roof. Accidents, the authorities called them, but I know better. There's something in this house, something malevolent." The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating in its finality. "And you believe this has to do with a curse?" "I do," he whispered, leaning forward. "There is a room in this house, Mr. Dalton, a room that doesn't appear on any plans, a room that no one alive has seen and lived to tell about. My grandfather, the last person to enter that room, left behind a journal that I found, and that led me to believe this room holds the key to everything that's happening." He handed me a small, leather-bound book, the pages yellowed with age. As I flipped through it, I caught glimpses of frantic scribbles, diagrams, and unsettling passages detailing horrific events, things that a man should not know, let alone write down. "The deaths," Ellsworth continued, "they started after I attempted to find the room, after I delved too deeply into my grandfather's secrets. My staff began dying, one by one, in ways that defy explanation. I need you to find that room, Mr. Dalton, and to stop whatever evil lies within it." I looked into Ellsworth's eyes and saw the terror that had hollowed him out. He wasn't just hiring me to investigate his house, he was begging me to save him, to save anyone who might set foot in that accursed mansion. "I'll do what I can," I said, though I couldn't ignore the chill creeping up my spine. As I took the journal and prepared to begin my search, the first shadow flickered across the walls, unnoticed by all but the house itself, as if it were watching, waiting for the next victim to stumble into its web. The journal felt heavy in my hands as I made my way through the mansion. The corridors twisted and turned, leading deeper into the heart of the house. I couldn't help but feel as if I were being swallowed by the darkness that pervaded every corner of Ellsworth Manor. The house seemed to come alive as I walked. Floorboards creaked underfoot, but when I paused to listen, the sound continued, as if someone, or something, was following close behind. Shadows danced in the flickering light of the antique lamps, shifting in ways that made my skin crawl. I had the unnerving sense that the mansion was aware of my presence and was preparing to reveal its secrets, but not without a price. I found myself drawn to a set of stairs leading to the second floor. Each step groaned under my weight, and with every creak, I imagined the house sighing, as though annoyed by my intrusion. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before me, lined with doors that led to rooms untouched by time. I decided to start with the room at the end of the hall, a door slightly ajar as if inviting me in. The room was a library, filled with towering shelves that reached the ceiling, crammed with books that smelled of dust and decay. It was a sanctuary for knowledge, yet the air was thick with something else, an emotion I couldn't quite place. I turned on a lamp, its dim light casting long shadows that made the space feel smaller, more claustrophobic. I scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Then, as I moved to the far corner, a section of the floorboard gave way under my foot with a hollow thud. I knelt down, examining the area more closely, and found a small, hidden compartment beneath the floor. Inside was an old wooden box, its surface scarred and worn. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the latch. A deep sense of unease gnawed at me, but curiosity won out. I opened the box, revealing a collection of old photographs and letters. As I sifted through them, I realized these were personal items, belonging to George Ellsworth's grandfather, Edward Ellsworth. The photographs were disturbing. They depicted the mansion in its early years, but in each image, there was something off, dark shapes lurking in the corners, shadows that didn't match the light sources. The people in the photos, presumably Edward's friends and family, appeared oblivious to the oddities, but their smiles looked forced, strained, as if they were hiding something. One photo in particular caught my attention. It was of Edward standing in front of what appeared to be a wall in the library, only there was no wall there now. In its place stood a large bookshelf, its presence seemingly an afterthought. I felt a chill as I realized that this might be a clue to the hidden room's location. I crossed the room to the shelf in question. It was filled with books of varying sizes, their spines cracked and faded, but something was off. The books were arranged too neatly, as if they had never been touched. I began pulling them from the shelf, one by one, until I noticed that a few of the titles didn't match their contents. I removed a book that seemed oddly light for its size, and behind it, I found a small lever, almost imperceptible. My heart pounded as I pulled the lever. The entire bookshelf trembled before it began to slide away, revealing a dark passageway behind it. A gust of cold, stale air rushed out, bringing with it the scent of mold and rot. I hesitated at the threshold, the darkness beyond seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. This was it, the entrance to the hidden room. But as I stepped forward, the lamp flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could hear a faint whispering echoing from the passageway, like voices from another time. Taking a deep breath, I pulled out my flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the oppressive gloom. I stepped into the passage, the floor cold and uneven beneath my feet. The walls were narrow, lined with rough stone, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. As I ventured deeper, the whispering grew louder, filling my head with incoherent words, fragments of conversations long forgotten. The passage ended at a heavy wooden door, bound in iron and carved with strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the light. I felt a sudden wave of nausea as I approached, the symbols burning into my mind like brands. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. The moment I touched the cold metal, a scream tore through the air, so loud and filled with agony that it felt like my eardrums would burst. The door swung open violently, and I stumbled backward, falling to the ground as the darkness from the room beyond seemed to surge out, engulfing me. For a moment, I couldn't see, couldn't hear, just darkness and that terrible, lingering scream. But as my vision cleared, I found myself staring into the room beyond the door. It was a small chamber, lined with stone and devoid of any furniture, save for a single wooden chair in the center. The walls were stained with something dark and viscous, and the floor was littered with old chains and shackles, their metal rusted and broken. But what truly horrified me was the figure in the chair. A skeletal corpse, slumped over, its limbs contorted in a way that suggested a violent death. The remnants of what must have been fine clothing clung to the bones, now reduced to tattered rags. A heavy iron collar encircled the neck, attached to a chain bolted to the floor. As I stared, paralyzed by the sight, the whispering voices grew louder, merging into a cacophony of madness. The walls seemed to close in, the room growing smaller, the darkness pressing against me from all sides. I had to get out now. But just as I turned to flee, the corpse's head jerked up with an unnatural speed, its hollow eye sockets locking onto mine. And then, it spoke. The words that emerged from the corpse's mouth were not spoken in any language I had ever heard, yet somehow, I understood them. The voice was raspy, a dry whisper that clawed at the edges of my sanity, each syllable sending a jolt of terror through my body. You have found it, the room where sins are born, where death is only the beginning. I tried to back away, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the cold stone floor. The flashlight in my hand flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls, making the room seem alive with movement. The skeletal figure's head tilted to one side, as if studying me, and I could feel its gaze penetrating my very soul. I was the first to bear the curse, the voice continued, echoing in the small chamber. Bound here by blood, by the darkness that feeds, I didn't want to listen, didn't want to know the horrors this entity had witnessed, but the voice compelled me, drawing me deeper into the nightmare. My name. Edward Ellsworth, it rasped, the name hanging in the air like a death knell. I sought power, knowledge, but I found only despair. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I was standing face to face with the man whose journal I still clutched in my hand, the man who had unleashed something unspeakable upon his own bloodline. Edward's skeletal hand twitched, and a dark, viscous fluid began to seep from the eye sockets of his skull, trailing down his hollow cheeks like tears of tar. His bony fingers curled, the joints cracking with the sound of dried twigs snapping underfoot. I opened the door. I summoned the darkness, and it consumed me, Edward whispered, his voice growing more distorted, layered with what sounded like the voices of 1,000 souls screaming in agony. Now, it hungers still, it must feed. The air around me grew thick, almost tangible, as if the very atmosphere was being drained of life. I could feel the darkness pressing closer, the whispering voices of the damned filling the room until it felt as though my head would split open. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if the mansion itself were alive, feeding off the fear that gripped my heart. Why me? I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. You are the next in line, Edward hissed, his jaw clenching with a sickening crack. The house has chosen you, to carry its burden. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. But there was no logic to be found, only the cold, inescapable truth that this was something far beyond my understanding, something ancient and evil, woven into the very fabric of the Ellsworth family's legacy. The room, it exists in a place between, Edward continued, his words now barely discernible through the rising tide of voices. It is a gateway, a prison, and once you enter, you can never truly leave. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath visible in the frigid air. The walls began to close in, the darkness swallowing the light from my flashlight until only the faintest glimmer remained. I could feel the pull of the room, a force dragging me toward the abyss, and I knew that if I didn't act now, I would be lost forever, just like Edward. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to move, stumbling backward toward the door. The darkness clawed at me, cold tendrils wrapping around my limbs, trying to drag me back into the chamber. Edward's voice followed me, growing fainter with each step, yet more desperate, more urgent. You cannot escape. It will follow you. It will. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, cutting off the last of his words. I collapsed against the stone wall of the passageway, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of what I had just experienced pressing down on me like a physical force. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands trembling uncontrollably. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness, revealing the passageway leading back to the library. I forced myself to stand, my legs weak and unsteady beneath me. The journal was still in my hand, the pages crumpled and stained with sweat. I had to get out of this house. I had to leave now. But as I made my way back through the passage, the walls seemed to shift and twist around me, as if the house were trying to trap me, to pull me back into its nightmarish depths. The whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that was somehow even more terrifying. I finally reached the library, the hidden door sliding shut behind me with a soft click. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, to calm the panic that clawed at my mind. But as I looked around the room, my heart sank. The books were back on the shelf, perfectly aligned, as if I had never touched them. The floorboards were intact, the hidden compartment gone without a trace. It was as if the passageway had never existed, as if everything I had just witnessed was some twisted illusion. But I knew better. The journal in my hand was proof of that. And the memory of Edward's voice, of his hollow eyes staring into mine, was burned into my mind, a scar that would never fade. I turned to leave, but the door to the library creaked open on its own, revealing the dark hallway beyond. And there, standing at the far end, was George Ellsworth. He was pale, his eyes wide with terror, his hands trembling as he gripped the frame of the door for support. He stared at me as if he had seen a ghost, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to form words. You found it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak, the weight of what I had uncovered pressing down on me like a leaden shroud. George took a step forward, his expression one of abject horror. "Then it's true, the curse, it's real, yes," I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse. "And it's not over. Whatever was in that room, it's still here. It's always been here." George's face contorted with fear, and he backed away, shaking his head in disbelief. No, this can't be happening," but it was happening. And as I stood there, the darkness seemed to gather around us, the house itself whispering secrets that were never meant to be heard. The air in the mansion grew heavier with each passing second, thick with dread as George Ellsworth's terror mirrored my own. His face, pale and drawn, seemed to age before my eyes as the reality of what we faced settled in. The curse was not some ancient superstition, it was a living, breathing malevolence that had woven itself into the fabric of the Ellsworth legacy. I stepped closer to George, but he recoiled, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and guilt. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's not just the room, it's the house. It's alive. It's been feeding off my family for generations." "Then we need to leave," I said, urgency creeping into my voice. "We need to get out of here, now," but George shook his head. "You don't get it, Mr. Dalton. There's no escape. The house won't let us leave. It's claimed too many lives, too many souls." His voice dropped to a low murmur, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "It won't stop until it has us all." I could see the madness beginning to take hold of him, the same madness that had driven his grandfather, Edward, to his doom. I grabbed George by the shoulders, shaking him slightly to snap him out of his trance. "Listen to me," I said firmly. "There has to be a way. We can destroy the room, the source of all this. We can end the curse." George's eyes focused on me, a flicker of hope breaking through the terror. But it was quickly extinguished as a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. We both froze, the noise sending a chill down my spine. It was coming from somewhere deep within the mansion, reverberating through the walls like the groan of a dying beast. "What was that?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. George swallowed hard. "It's the house," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's waking up." I didn't have time to question him further. The sound grew louder, closer, as if whatever was making it was moving towards us. Without thinking, I grabbed George's arm and pulled him down the hallway, away from the source of the noise. We ran through the mansion, the floorboards creaking and groaning under our feet as if the house itself were alive and trying to stop us. The darkness seemed to thicken around us, the walls closing in, twisting and shifting as if the house were reshaping itself to keep us trapped. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I could feel the malevolent presence growing stronger, feeding off our fear. We turned a corner and found ourselves in a narrow corridor lined with doors. Each door was identical, plain and unmarked, but the oppressive atmosphere was suffocating. The corridor stretched on, impossibly long, and no matter how far we ran, the end seemed to elude us. I stopped, panting for breath, trying to make sense of what was happening. "We're going in circles," I gasped, looking around desperately. "This isn't right." George's face was pale, drenched in sweat. "It's the house," he repeated, his voice hollow. "It's playing with us. It's toying with our minds." The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even more terrifying. The only sound was our ragged breathing, echoing off the walls. I glanced at the doors lining the corridor, my mind racing. "One of these doors has to lead out," I said, more to myself than to George. "We just have to find the right one." George looked at me, his expression bleak. "Or it could lead to something worse." But what choice did we have? The house was a maze of shifting corridors and endless halls, and staying put would only make us easier prey for whatever horror lurked within. I approached the nearest door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The metal was ice cold, sending a shiver up my spine. I hesitated, listening for any sign of movement on the other side. But there was nothing, only the suffocating silence. I turned the handle and pushed the door open, revealing a room that was nearly identical to the one I had just fled. The same dark wood paneling, the same antique furniture draped in dusty sheets, and in the center, another heavy wooden door. "We're trapped," George said, his voice trembling with despair. "It's hopeless." "No," I said firmly, pushing down my own rising panic. "We can't give up. We have to keep moving." But before I could take another step, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the walls began to close in, the shadows lengthening and twisting into grotesque shapes. The malevolent presence in the house was growing stronger, more tangible, feeding off our fear and despair. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us, sealing us in. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. George stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the shadows that seemed to pulse and writhe like living things. And then, without warning, one of the shadows detached itself from the wall and began to move toward us. It was amorphous, shifting and changing shape as it advanced, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. George let out a strangled cry, backing away from the approaching horror. "No. No, please, stay away." But the shadow continued its slow, deliberate advance, the air around it growing colder with every step. I could feel the darkness seeping into my bones, numbing my mind, sapping my will to fight. I had to do something, anything, before it was too late. Grabbing the journal from my coat, I flipped through its pages, desperately searching for anything that might help us. The words swam before my eyes, the ink blurring and twisting into nonsensical patterns as the malevolent force in the room exerted its influence. Then, I found it, a passage scrawled in Edward's frantic handwriting, barely legible but unmistakably urgent: "The house feeds on fear. It thrives in darkness. But it can be weakened, light is its bane, bring the light, and the shadows will retreat." I had no idea if it would work, but I had no other options. I shoved the journal into my pocket and fumbled for my flashlight, flipping it on and aiming the beam at the advancing shadow. The effect was immediate. The shadow recoiled from the light, its form shuddering and distorting as it tried to pull away. The air in the room grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. It's working, I shouted, the surge of hope giving me strength. We need more light, but George was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear as the shadow shifted and writhed in the beam of the flashlight. I can't, George, snap out of it, I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. We need to work together. Find something, anything, that will produce light, but George was too far gone, his eyes locked on the shifting shadow as it fought against the beam of light. And then, before I could react, the shadow split in two, one half lurching toward George with unnatural speed. The flashlight flickered in my hand as I swung it toward George, but I was too late. The shadow enveloped him, wrapping around him like a shroud. George let out a blood-curdling scream as the darkness consumed him, his body convulsing in agony as the shadow seemed to drain the life from him. I lunged forward, my heart pounding in my chest, but the shadow had already receded, leaving behind nothing but an empty, crumpled heap on the floor. George was gone, his body reduced to a withered husk, his eyes wide open in a final, silent scream. A wave of nausea hit me as I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. The shadow loomed over me, its form growing larger, more defined, as if feeding off George's death had made it stronger. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to focus. The flashlight was still in my hand, the beam barely holding the shadow at bay. But I needed something more, something stronger, or I would end up just like George. I glanced around the room, searching for anything that could help. My eyes landed on a tall candelabra standing in the corner, covered in dust but still intact. I rushed to it, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste. Grabbing the candelabra, I frantically searched my pockets for a lighter, praying that I had brought one with me. The shadow was closing in, the air growing colder with each passing second. My fingers trembled as I finally found the lighter, flicking it on and bringing the flame to the candles. One by one, the candles flared to life, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. The shadow creature recoiled, its form shuddering and distorting as the light pushed it back. I could feel the tide beginning to turn, the darkness retreating in the face of the light. But I knew it wasn't over yet. The shadow was still there, lurking at the edges of the room, waiting for the light to falter. I had to find a way out before it gathered enough strength to strike again. With the candelabra in one hand and the flashlight in the other, I made my way back to the door, praying that it would open. My heart raced as I reached for the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily under my hand. The door swung open, and I stumbled out into the corridor, the oppressive darkness receding as I moved away from the room. But as I fled down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. And I knew, deep down, that the house wasn't done with me yet. I didn't stop running until I reached the grand staircase. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my pulse pounded in my ears, but I couldn't afford to rest. The house felt alive, its walls pulsating with a dark energy, as if it were a living creature intent on trapping me within its monstrous embrace. Every creak and groan of the old mansion sent shivers down my spine, and the shadows seemed to twist and crawl, ready to snatch me the moment I let my guard down. I gripped the candelabra tightly, the flickering flames my only protection against the encroaching darkness. The warmth of the light offered a fragile sense of security, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the house made its next move. The malevolent presence that had claimed George and tormented Edward Ellsworth was not finished with me. Not yet. As I descended the stairs, my mind raced, trying to piece together a plan. The journal had mentioned light as the house's weakness, but I needed something more, a way to sever its connection to the hidden room, to destroy whatever evil force was fueling this nightmare. Reaching the ground floor, I was met with a chilling sight. The once grand foyer was now a twisted, distorted version of itself. The chandelier hung at an odd angle, its crystals shattered and scattered across the floor like fragments of a broken dream. The walls, which had once been adorned with ornate tapestries and portraits, were now streaked with black, oozing tendrils that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the temperature had dropped to a bone-chilling cold. But what truly caught my attention was the figure standing at the base of the staircase. It was Edward Ellsworth, or at least what was left of him. His skeletal form, once confined to the hidden room, now stood before me, shrouded in a dark mist that seemed to writhe and twist around him like living shadows. "You cannot escape," Edward's voice echoed, distorted and layered with the voices of countless others. "The house is bound to you now, as it was to me. It will consume you, just as it did to all who came before." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my fear in check. "I won't let that happen. There has to be a way to break the curse, to destroy this evil once and for all." Edward tilted his head, his hollow eye sockets staring into mine. "There is no escape. The house feeds on despair, on fear. It will take you, as it took me. There is no other end." "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "There is another way. You said it yourself, the house feeds on fear. But what if I deny it that? What if I refuse to be afraid?" The shadows around Edward seemed to ripple with anger, and his voice grew darker, more insistent. "You cannot fight it. The darkness is too strong. It will consume you, body and soul." But I had no other choice. I had seen what fear had done to George, what it had done to Edward, and I refused to let it happen to me. Clutching the candelabra, I took a step forward, then another, forcing myself to confront the horror that had taken root in the mansion. The shadows writhed and twisted, lashing out at me like dark tendrils, but the light from the candles kept them at bay. The closer I got to Edward, the more the darkness recoiled, as if the light was burning it away. Edward's form began to waver, his skeletal features dissolving into the mist. "You will fail," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The house will not let you leave." "I'm not leaving," I said, my voice steady now. "I'm ending this." With that, I turned and ran toward the center of the foyer, where the black tendrils were thickest, where the darkness seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew it was the source, the heart of the evil that had taken over Ellsworth Manor. The closer I got, the stronger the pull of the darkness became. It was like wading through a thick, suffocating fog, every step a battle against an unseen force that wanted to drag me down, to drown me in despair. But I kept moving, kept pushing forward, the light from the candelabra my only lifeline. Finally, I reached it, a doorway that had appeared in the center of the foyer, a doorway that hadn't been there before. It was old, ancient, and covered in the same dark symbols I had seen in the hidden room. The wood was blackened, charred, as if it had been burned from within, and the doorframe seemed to pulse with a dark energy. I hesitated for just a moment, fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve. But then I remembered George, remembered the look of terror in his eyes as the shadows consumed him. I couldn't let that happen to anyone else. Not ever again. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond was small, almost claustrophobic, and completely empty, save for a single object in the center. It was an old, weathered book, its cover worn and cracked with age. The pages were yellowed, and the edges were charred, as if it had been pulled from the very fires of hell itself. The book seemed to radiate a dark energy, a malevolence that filled the room, making it almost impossible to breathe. I knew without a doubt that this was the source, the heart of the curse that had plagued the Ellsworth family for generations. And I knew what I had to do. Without hesitation, I raised the candelabra and brought the flames down onto the book. The moment the flames touched the book, the room erupted in a blinding light. The darkness recoiled, the shadows screaming in agony as they were burned away, consumed by the purifying fire. The walls trembled, the floor buckled, and the very air seemed to vibrate with a deafening roar as the curse was torn apart, piece by piece. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes from the intense light, as the book burst into flames, consumed by the fire that had been unleashed. The light grew brighter, hotter, until it felt like the entire world was burning around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The light faded, the heat dissipated, and I found myself standing in the center of the foyer, the candelabra still in my hand. The book was gone, reduced to a pile of ashes at my feet, and the dark tendrils that had filled the room had vanished, leaving only the cold, empty silence of the mansion. I took a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. It was over. The curse was broken. The darkness that had haunted the Ellsworth family for so long was gone. But as I stood there, surrounded by the ruins of what had once been a grand, majestic home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike. I shook my head, pushing the thought away. No, it was over. The evil was gone, and I was free. But as I turned to leave the mansion, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape, just at the edge of my vision, vanishing into the shadows. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. Only the empty, silent halls of Ellsworth Manor, lit by the soft glow of the candles. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. It was just my imagination. The curse was broken. The house was just a house now, empty, lifeless. But as I stepped out into the cold night air, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. The mansion loomed behind me, its dark windows like empty eyes, watching as I walked away. And deep within the shadows of the house, something stirred, a faint whisper, barely audible, carried on the cold night wind. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because in the silence of the night, I knew the truth: some doors should never be opened. Some secrets are better left buried. And some houses are never truly empty.